What happens when a manager thinks he holds all the power, only to realize he was judging the CEO all along? When Ava Mitchell walks into Sterling & Co., she's met with prejudice, condescension, and unfair treatment. But little does Richard Davenport know, he's digging his own grave. How will he react when the truth is finally revealed? Watch the full story on H2 Black Thread. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Ava Mitchell believed in preparation. She had spent years working her way up in the cutthroat world of corporate strategy, and if there was one thing she had learned, it was that first impressions mattered. That was why, as she stood outside the towering glass building of Sterling & Co., she took a steadying breath before stepping inside. The lobby was grand, sleek, and intimidating. Marble floors stretched beneath towering floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the New York skyline. Employees moved like clockwork, fast, efficient, and highly polished. Their crisp suits and purposeful strides made it clear this was not a place for the weak. Good. Ava had never been weak. She adjusted the gold cufflinks on her tailored black pantsuit, ran a quick hand over her smooth, braided bun, and walked toward the front desk. She belonged here. "Good morning," she said, her voice even and professional. "Ava Mitchell. I'm starting today as a strategic consultant." The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a neat blonde bob, paused mid-typing. She looked up, her gaze flicking over Ava with something that felt like mild surprise. It lasted only a second before she recovered, forcing a polite smile. "Oh, yes, welcome. Let me just—" she clicked through the system. "You'll be reporting to Mr. Davenport. His office is just past the bullpen on the right." Ava nodded. "Thank you." She knew exactly who Richard Davenport was. The man had been with Sterling & Co. for nearly 15 years, rising through the ranks from junior consultant to branch manager. He had a reputation for being sharp, no-nonsense, and ruthlessly traditional. He liked things his way, and he had very little patience for change. And if the company's internal culture reviews were anything to go by, he had an even smaller amount of patience for employees who didn't fit the mold. Ivy League graduates, male, preferably from old money families. Ava was none of the above, which meant she was already walking into an uphill battle. She strode through the bullpen, her steps confident. The open concept office buzzed with energy. Groups of consultants huddled in discussion. Analysts tapped away at spreadsheets and assistants rushed between desks, juggling calls and files. This was exactly the kind of environment Ava thrived in, fast-paced, high stakes, and filled with power plays. She was ready. But as she turned the corner, she was met not with a handshake nor a greeting but an accusation. "You're late." Ava stopped short. The words landed like a gavel hitting a desk. Her eyes flicked to the wall clock, 8:50 a.m. She turned her gaze back to Richard Davenport, who stood in the doorway of his office, arms crossed. Tall, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. The permanent scowl on his face told her everything she needed to know. He had already decided who she was. He had already judged her. And she hadn't even spoken yet. Ava kept her expression neutral. "According to my contract, the workday starts at 9 a.m. It's currently 8:50. Richard didn't blink. "Here," he said, his voice flat, "we expect employees to arrive at least 30 minutes early. Being on time isn't enough. It shows a lack of initiative." So this was how today was going to go. Ava had dealt with men like Richard before. They weren't interested in skill. They were interested in control. And today he was already trying to put her in her place. She could have argued, could have pointed out that no one else in the bullpen had arrived at 8:30, but she didn't. She simply met his gaze, steady and unshaken. Understood. Richard seemed annoyed by her lack of reaction. He studied her for a moment longer before turning on his heel. "Follow me." Ava did. As they walked through the bullpen, she could feel the eyes on her. People stole quick, cautious glances before turning back to their screens, pretending to be busy. They knew what was happening. She had walked into a battlefield and the troops were already too scared to move. She had expected Richard to lead her to the consultants section, the space where her expertise belonged. Instead, he kept walking, past the analysts, past the senior consultants' offices, past everything that mattered. And then he stopped, in front of a tiny, windowless workspace near the copy room. Ava stared at it. It was cramped, dimly lit, and completely isolated from the rest of the office. The desk was cluttered with old stacks of files. The hum of the copy machine filled the silence, and the air smelled faintly of toner and somebody's forgotten coffee. She turned to Richard, expression unreadable. "This is my workspace. It's where you'll start." Ava let the silence stretch. She knew exactly what this was, a power move, a warning. He was waiting for her to flinch, to push back, to confirm whatever bias he already had. Instead, she smiled. Not a big, bright, fake smile, just a small, knowing one. The kind of smile that said, "I see what you're doing, and I'm not playing your game." She stepped inside. She set her briefcase down on the desk, casually brushing a stray folder aside, then turned back to him. "All right," she said evenly. "What's first?" For a split second, Richard hesitated. He had been expecting frustration, discomfort, maybe even a little fear. Instead, he got nothing, just calm. That seemed to annoy him more than anything. "I'll have someone bring you some files," he said briskly. "Get familiar with them before asking for anything more." With that, he turned and walked away. Ava waited until she heard his footsteps fade. Then she exhaled slowly, rolled her shoulders back, and allowed herself one brief, quiet chuckle. She had handled worse than Richard Davenport, and whether he knew it or not, this was only the beginning. Ava had been in difficult work environments before. She had seen condescension wrapped in politeness, had experienced microaggressions disguised as company culture, and had watched incompetent men get promoted while brilliant women were overlooked. So when Richard Davenport dropped a heavy stack of old financial records onto her desk with a loud thud, she knew exactly what was happening. She didn't react. She simply looked down at the files, then back up at him, expression unreadable. "Go through these. Make sure the figures match up. We can't have mistakes in our records," he said, his tone clipped, already turning away. Ava glanced at the yellowing pages, some with coffee stains, others barely legible from years of handling. This was not the kind of work a strategic consultant was supposed to be doing. This was intern work. Yet here she was, sitting in a cramped workspace near the copy room, tasked with something that had nothing to do with her expertise. She took a slow, measured breath. And she smiled. "Of course, Mr. Davenport, I'll get started." Richard paused mid-step. He had been expecting frustration, maybe even an argument. Instead, he got poise. For a moment, he seemed almost annoyed by it. But he didn't say anything. He just walked away. And that's when Ava knew this was a game, and he was waiting for her to lose her patience. Hours passed. Ava worked through the financial records, scanning years-old spreadsheets, correcting discrepancies, and mentally cataloging the inefficiency of this entire task. Occasionally, employees walked past her tiny workspace. Most ignored her, but a few stole quick glances, curious, hesitant, knowing. She noticed one man in particular, David Miller. A senior consultant, mid-40s, the type of man who had clearly been at Sterling & Co. long enough to understand how things worked. He had passed by Ava's workspace twice now. The first time, he had given her a brief, almost apologetic look before quickly turning away. The second time, he hesitated. Ava caught his gaze. For a moment, it looked like he wanted to say something. But then, he didn't. He just shook his head to himself and walked off. Ava noted it. There were two types of people in offices like this, those who played the game, and those who watched from the sidelines, too afraid to challenge the rules. David was the latter, for now. By noon, she had gone through 3 binders of outdated financial records. She had not been introduced to her team. She had not been given access to company systems. And when a client meeting was announced over the office intercom, she decided it was time to push back, just a little. She walked to Richard's office, knocking once before stepping inside. He barely looked up from his laptop. "Yes, I'd like to sit in on the client meeting this afternoon," Ava said evenly. Richard finally looked up and scoffed. "You're new," he said, shaking his head like she had just asked for something outrageous. "Learn to follow orders before asking for more responsibility." Ava held his gaze. "I have over 8 years of experience leading strategy meetings with Fortune 500 clients. I'm more than qualified to contribute." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her. Then he smirked. "Oh, I'm sure you have plenty of experience. But here we do things differently. Respect is earned, Mitchell." She could hear the unspoken words beneath it. "You don't belong here." She could have pressed further. She could have listed her credentials, argued her worth, demanded a seat at the table. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. "Understood, Mr. Davenport." And then she turned and left his office. By the time lunch rolled around, Ava had already received a second stack of outdated files and an additional task to reorganize a supply closet. She hadn't even taken off her blazer yet. She grabbed a coffee from the break room, leaning against the counter when a voice beside her said, "Don't take it personally." Ava turned. A woman, mid-30s, sharp eyes, blonde hair tied into a neat bun, stood next to her, stirring cream into her cup. "Excuse me." The woman glanced toward the break room door before lowering her voice. "Richard doesn't like women speaking up, especially black women." Ava took a slow sip of her coffee. "And you are?" "Sophie, I've been here 5 years," she exhaled, setting her spoon down with a quiet clink. "I've seen it before." Women get hired, and if they don't fit his idea of the right kind, he makes sure they never last long. Ava tilted her head. "So you're saying I have an expiration date?" Sophie gave a small, humorless chuckle. "I'm saying you might want to watch your back." Ava studied her. Sophie wasn't being cruel. She wasn't gloating. If anything, she looked tired. Like she had seen too many people walk through these doors hoping to make a difference, only to be pushed out before they had the chance. Ava took another sip of coffee. "I appreciate the warning," Sophie nodded once. "Good luck." Then she walked away. Ava stayed in the break room for a few minutes longer, turning over everything that had happened that morning. She could have left right then. She could have packed up, walked out, and found a company that actually valued her skills. But she didn't. Because now it wasn't just about a job, it was about proving a point. Ava didn't break easily. And Richard Davenport, he had no idea what was coming. By mid-afternoon, Ava had lost count of how many times Richard had gone out of his way to undermine her. It wasn't just the meaningless tasks he had assigned her. It was the way he did it. The patronizing tone, the dismissive glances, the deliberate exclusion from conversations, meetings, and projects, things that should have been part of her job. And yet, she never faltered. She completed every task, not because she was willing to accept this treatment, but because she was watching, studying, waiting. And at precisely 3:00 p.m., Richard made his biggest mistake yet. Richard's office was as cold and impersonal as the man himself. Dark wood furniture, a spotless glass desk, a single framed photo of what appeared to be a golden retriever. Ava barely had time to take it all in before Richard, who had barely looked at her all day, gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." She did. He clasped his hands on the desk, exhaling like this was an unfortunate but necessary conversation. "I don't think you're a good fit for this company." Ava blinked once, expression unreadable. "Is that so?" Richard nodded, slow, firm, final. "You don't seem to understand how things are done here. We have a standard, Mitchell, and frankly, I don't see you lasting long term. Today will be your last day." And just like that, he sat back, waiting. He had done this before. Ava could see it in the way he studied her reaction, anticipating anger, confusion, maybe even desperation. But he got none of it, because Ava had been expecting this from the moment she walked through the door. Instead, she simply reached down, unlatched her briefcase, and pulled out a folder. Without a word, she slid it across the desk. Richard frowned but took it, flipping open the cover, and then his entire world came crashing down. The moment Richard's eyes landed on the first page, his entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the composed authority, the smug confidence, the power he thought he had. His face drained of color, his fingers tightened around the folder. Because staring back at him in bold, undeniable letters were words that changed everything. Ava Mitchell, CEO and co-founder of Sterling & Co. Silence. Thick, heavy, suffocating. Richard's throat bobbed as he forced out a disbelieving, choked laugh. This is a joke, right?" Ava leaned forward slightly, voice calm, measured. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Richard's fingers twitched as he turned the page, and there it was. Legal documents, shareholder records, financial statements proving without a shadow of a doubt that Ava wasn't just an employee. She owned this company. She had founded it. And today, she had sat through hours of humiliation, condescension, and blatant discrimination just to see how one of her senior managers treated new hires. And now Richard was realizing the truth. And it was too late. For the first time since they met, Richard had no words. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no explanation, no excuse, no justification could save him from the situation he had created for himself. Ava finally broke the silence. "Today I watched how you treated me," she said, her voice unwavering. "I watched how you dismissed me, how you excluded me from meetings, how you handed me tasks meant for an intern, how you decided from the moment I walked in that I wasn't the right fit." She let that sink in. Richard swallowed hard. But she cut him off. "I don't want a justification, Mr. Davenport, because there isn't one." Her voice was firm, cool, unshaken. "What I saw today tells me everything I need to know about you. And it tells me everything I need to know about how many talented individuals you've pushed out of this company before they even had a chance." She stood. Richard jerked upright. "Now, hold on." But Ava was already walking toward the door. She stopped just before reaching it, turning slightly over her shoulder. "Tomorrow, Mr. Davenport," she said smoothly. "Don't bother coming in." And then she walked out, her back straight, her steps steady, because this was the moment Richard Davenport lost everything. Richard Davenport had always believed in control. For 15 years, he had made the decisions. He had built his reputation on quick judgments, firm leadership, and an unshakable belief that he knew best. He decided who got promoted. He decided who got sidelined. And up until 5 minutes ago, he had assumed he was in control of Ava Mitchell's fate. But now his hands were shaking. His fingers twitched as he clutched the folder that had shattered everything he thought he knew. Ava Mitchell, CEO and co-founder of Sterling & Co. His face drained of color. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. For the first time since she had walked into his office, he couldn't find his voice. Ava had known all along. She had known from the moment she stepped into the building. And still, she had sat through an entire day of his condescension, his arrogance, his blatant attempts to humiliate her. Why? Why hadn't she stopped him sooner? Why had she let him dig his own grave? And then it hit him. She wanted to see. She wanted to see exactly how he treated people. And now he was paying for it. Richard's hands tightened around the folder. A dull, cold panic was creeping into his chest. Everything he had done today, every smug remark, every dismissive glance, every power play, was now evidence against him. Evidence that Ava Mitchell, his boss, had witnessed firsthand. He could already see the fallout, the internal meetings, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, the company emails that would announce his sudden, unexpected departure. And the looks, the ones that said, "I always knew he'd push the wrong person too far. Can you believe he did this to the CEO? He's done this before. How many people has he pushed out of this company?" A wave of nausea hit him. His control was slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time in his career there was nothing he could do about it. Across from him, Ava was completely still, not gloating, not reveling in his downfall, just watching. Her expression was unreadable, her confidence unshaken. Finally she spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled, a verdict being delivered. "Today I personally witnessed how you treat employees, especially women and people of color." Richard's throat tightened. Her words carried weight. They were final, undeniable. "This is not the culture I want at my company." Richard opened his mouth, but no excuse came, because what could he possibly say? How could he defend his actions when he had been so blatant, so obvious in his bias? His silence stretched between them, and Ava let it. Let him sit in the weight of his own arrogance. Let him feel the crushing reality of what he had done. Finally, he forced out the only thing that came to mind. I didn't know." Ava raised a brow. "Didn't know what exactly?" Richard swallowed hard. "Didn't know she was the CEO? Or didn't know that he was a walking embodiment of corporate discrimination?" Either way, his answer didn't matter, because Ava had already made her decision. Richard's mind was racing. There had to be a way out of this. There always was. Maybe if he apologized, maybe if he promised to change. "I can fix this," he blurted out, the words tumbling out before he even knew what he was saying. Ava paused. Then she laughed, not loud, not amused, just a small, sharp chuckle, the kind that made it very clear he had just said the wrong thing. She turned slightly over her shoulder, her gaze cool and steady. "No, Mr. Davenport," she said smoothly. "You don't need to fix anything." Richard's stomach dropped. Ava took a slow step toward the door. He could feel his career slipping away with each step she took. He needed to stop this. He needed to say something. "Ava, wait." But she didn't wait. She stopped at the door, but she didn't turn to face him. Instead, she delivered the final blow. "You don't need to come in tomorrow." Silence, crushing, unforgiving. Then she walked out, and Richard Davenport, for the first time in his life, he was the one left behind. The hum of morning activity filled the office of Sterling & Co. As employees logged into their systems, grabbed their first cups of coffee and settled in for another workday. But today, something was different, something was off, and it took only one glance at their inboxes to understand why. Richard Davenport is no longer with Sterling & Co. That was it. No long-winded explanation. No effective immediately due to unforeseen circumstances. Just one single cold, factual statement. Richard Davenport, the man who had ruled this office with an iron grip for 15 years, was gone, and the silence that followed, it was deafening. For a few moments, no one moved. No one spoke. People exchanged glances, waiting to see who would be the first to react. Then, finally, a quiet exhale. From somewhere near the break room, someone muttered, "About damn time." And just like that, the tension cracked. Whispers spread through the office like wildfire. "Did you see the email?" "I knew this day would come." He must have finally pissed off the wrong person. They didn't know the full story, not yet, but they knew enough. They knew Richard had been playing with fire for years, and now he had finally burned himself. People moved through the office differently that morning. There was no edge of fear in the air. No one rushed to perfect their posture when walking past Richard's now empty office. No one avoided eye contact, worried they'd be the next target of his dismissive remarks. For the first time in a long time, Sterling and Co. felt lighter. Even the coffee tasted better. David Miller, one of the senior consultants, sat at his desk, staring at the screen. He had worked under Richard for years. He had witnessed countless meetings where good employees were pushed out for no reason other than not fitting the company culture. And every single time, he had said nothing. He had justified it to himself. It's just how things are. It's not my battle to fight. As long as it's not me, I'll be fine. But today, Richard Davenport, the man who had once decided everyone else's fate, had been removed without warning, without a farewell speech, without a chance to save himself. And now David had to face an uncomfortable truth. Silence had been easy. Silence had been safe. But silence had never been right. And today he decided he would never be silent again. Sophie had spent years watching new hires struggle under Richard's rule. The way he would single them out, the way he would quietly make them disappear. She had warned so many of them, told them to be careful, to watch their backs, to never expect fairness. But today, for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to whisper warnings in the break room. She didn't need to lower her voice when discussing office politics. Because today the office was no longer Richard's playground. And that felt damn good. She took a sip of her coffee, smiling for the first time in a long time. Change had finally come, and she had a feeling. It was just the beginning. At precisely 9:30 a.m., a second email hit inboxes. Sterling and Co. is moving forward under a new leadership team dedicated to fostering an environment of fairness, inclusion, and excellence. The message was clear. Discrimination would no longer be tolerated. Employees would be judged by their skills, not their appearance. The culture of silence. Over. This wasn't just a one-time cleanup. This was a shift in the foundation of the company itself. And for those who had suffered under Richard's reign, for those who had bit their tongues and endured, this was the sign they had been waiting for. Ava Mitchell didn't need to send an email. She didn't need to stand in front of the office and make a speech. Her presence alone was the message. She had walked into Sterling and Co. as a test, and in less than 24 hours, she had completely reshaped its future. She had exposed a deep-rooted problem, and she had removed it without hesitation. Because that was leadership, not power, not intimidation, but the ability to create change, the kind of change that lasted, the kind of change that Richard Davenport would never be a part of. By 1000 a.m., Richard had cleaned out his office. No grand exit, no last-minute speech to justify himself. Just a defeated man carrying a box of his own mistakes. He had spent years believing he knew best, years thinking he could judge people at a glance, and yet he had failed to see the most important thing of all, the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had treated as unworthy, was the woman who owned the company, and now he was the one being dismissed, the one being judged, and no one was fighting for him. Because in the end, he had never fought for anyone else. Richard's downfall wasn't just about one bad day, it was about a lifetime of bad choices. Never judge someone by their appearance. True leadership isn't about power, it's about fairness and respect. The person you underestimate might just be the one in charge, and Richard had learned that lesson the hard way. If this story inspired you, like, share, and subscribe to H2 Black Thread for more powerful stories.